She's always been jealous of me. That was the first sentence my sister Vanessa chose to say at my wedding reception, standing beneath a canopy of white roses and soft gold lights that I had spent 12 months planning down to the last ribbon. The microphone carried her voice clearly across the ballroom of the Harborview Country Club, over the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the low hum of polite conversation, and for a moment I felt the entire room tilt in her direction. I didn't flinch. I didn't interrupt. I simply lifted my chin and smiled, the way I had practiced in the mirror the night before, because I had learned a long time ago that silence can be louder than any defense. Just hours earlier, I had stood at the front of St. Andrew's Church with Daniel Brooks, sunlight filtering through stained glass and catching in the lace of my gown, promising to build a life measured not in competition but in kindness. The morning had felt sacred, almost fragile, like fine china you're careful not to chip. My mother, Margaret Carter, had cried softly in the first pew. Friends had traveled from as far as Seattle and Austin to be there. Everything about the day was supposed to mark a beginning. Yet as Vanessa held her crystal flute in the air and gave that knowing half-smile she had perfected since childhood, I recognized the tone beneath her words. It wasn't playful teasing. It was a claim. Even growing up, she continued lightly, Emily always wanted what I had. A few guests laughed, uncertain. Someone near the dance floor shifted in their chair. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around mine, just enough for me to notice. I kept my expression calm, feeling the cool weight of my wedding band against my finger, reminding myself that moments like this are not accidents. They are choices. The string quartet paused between songs. The air felt thinner. Vanessa spoke as though she were telling an endearing family story, but I knew the pattern. I had lived inside it for 32 years. From the outside, we were the Carter sisters, two blonde girls in matching Easter dresses, two honor roll students, two bridesmaids at each other's college graduations. But inside our home in Fairfield, Connecticut, comparisons were a quiet currency. Vanessa was the bold one. The magnetic one. I was the careful one. The observer. When she made a joke at my expense, adults would wave it off as sibling rivalry. When she borrowed something without asking, I was told not to be dramatic. And when she dated Daniel briefly in her mid-20s, a fact she liked to describe as ancient history, I was the one who heard whispers about loyalty. Standing there in a ballroom that smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and fresh-cut peonies, I realized this speech wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate. Vanessa had asked for the microphone. She had insisted on a toast. I could see the faint flush in her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes that always appeared when she believed she was in control of the narrative. But I suppose, she added with a laugh, today proves she finally caught up. The words hung in the air, polished and sharp. I let the silence stretch just a fraction longer than comfortable. I felt my heartbeat steady instead of race. Because what my sister didn't know, what no one in that ballroom knew yet, was that I had already heard every version of this story she planned to tell. And I had come prepared, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more patient than jealousy. Vanessa lowered the microphone slowly, as if she had just offered something generous instead of something sharp, and the room responded with scattered applause that sounded more uncertain than celebratory. I could feel eyes moving between us, measuring the tension, deciding whether this was harmless sister humor or something heavier. I kept my shoulders relaxed and brought my champagne glass to my lips without actually taking a sip. Daniel leaned slightly toward me and whispered that he loved me. His voice was steady, but there was a question inside it. I squeezed his hand once to reassure him, then released it gently and stepped forward before the silence turned awkward. I thanked Vanessa for her words, my tone warm and even, and I thanked everyone for traveling so far to celebrate with us. I spoke about new beginnings, about gratitude, about how families are complicated and beautiful at the same time. A few guests nodded, relieved to have something safe to hold on to. The band resumed playing a soft instrumental version of a classic love song, and servers began circulating with plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables. On the surface, the evening returned to its schedule. Beneath it, something had shifted. As I moved from table to table greeting guests, I noticed small details that most people would have missed. Vanessa remained near the center of the room, laughing a little too brightly, retelling pieces of her toast to anyone who would listen. My mother avoided my eyes. She busied herself adjusting floral arrangements that did not need adjusting. An old family friend from our neighborhood, Mrs. Harper, touched my arm and said quietly that I looked radiant. The word carried more meaning than she intended. Radiant meant composed. Composed meant unaffected. I had spent the last 72 hours replaying a conversation in my mind, a conversation that had taken place in Daniel's home office late one evening while he thought I was asleep. I had walked down the hallway to ask him about seating charts and heard my name through the partially closed door. I did not eavesdrop at first. I simply paused. Vanessa's voice had been on speaker, smooth and urgent, asking him if he was absolutely certain about this marriage. She had spoken about history, about chemistry, about mistakes that could still be corrected. Daniel had answered firmly that he loved me and that the past was over. I had stood there in the dim light, listening to my sister try to rewrite my future in real time. When I stepped back into our bedroom that night, I did not cry. I did not confront anyone. I lay awake and let the pieces settle into place. So when she stood in front of 200 guests and suggested that jealousy defined me, I recognized it for what it was. It was projection. It was fear dressed up as humor. Across the dance floor, Daniel caught my eye again. He looked concerned, protective. I smiled at him, a real smile this time, because I knew something he did not. The evening was far from over, and narratives have a way of unraveling when they are built on half-truths. I adjusted the train of my gown, straightened my posture, and allowed myself to feel the calm that comes when you understand the difference between being accused and being exposed. Vanessa believed she had set the tone for this reception. She believed she had framed the story. But stories, especially family stories, have layers. And I had decided that tonight, if the truth came forward, it would not arrive in anger. It would arrive in clarity. The first dance began under a wash of amber light, and for a few minutes the world narrowed to the steady rhythm of Daniel's heartbeat beneath my palm and the soft glide of satin across polished wood. Applause rose gently around us as we turned in slow circles, and I let myself feel the simplicity of the moment. Marriage is not a performance. It is a promise. When the song ended, guests drifted toward the bar and dessert tables, and the volume in the room lifted again. Vanessa was no longer by the centerpieces. She stood near the terrace doors, speaking closely with two of Daniel's former colleagues, her expression animated. I noticed the way she leaned in, the way she touched one of their sleeves as if confiding something private. It was subtle, but I knew that posture. I had seen it before at high school award ceremonies and college graduations, whenever attention began to settle on me for too long. I excused myself from a conversation with Daniel's aunt and stepped outside onto the terrace. The air off the harbor carried a faint saltiness, and the string lights overhead flickered against the dark water. From inside, laughter spilled through the open doors. I could see Vanessa's silhouette against the ballroom lights, her gestures wide, confident. I remembered another night 2 weeks earlier, when she had insisted on taking Daniel out for coffee to clear the air about their past. She had framed it as maturity. Closure. Daniel had told me about it afterward, almost casually, saying she wanted to make sure there were no awkward feelings before the wedding. I had nodded then, but I had watched his face carefully. He had seemed unsettled, not tempted, not nostalgic, but aware of something unresolved on her side. That was when I asked him directly if there was anything I needed to know. He had looked me in the eye and said there was not. I believed him. Trust is not blind. It is chosen. Inside the ballroom, the master of ceremonies announced the cake cutting. Guests gathered near the towering white confection decorated with sugar roses. I re-entered the room just as Vanessa slipped back toward the crowd, her smile bright, her composure restored. As Daniel and I held the knife together, I caught fragments of conversation behind us. Someone asked quietly if siblings were always so competitive. Another voice replied that old dynamics die hard. I felt the familiar pressure of being misunderstood, of having my character summarized in a single word. Jealous. It is a convenient label. It requires no evidence. It erases context. When we fed each other a small bite of cake, the room applauded again, and cameras flashed. I looked out over the faces of people who had known me since childhood and people who had met me only months ago. I wondered how many of them were measuring me against my sister's version of events. I wondered how many had ever questioned why Vanessa felt the need to define me at my own celebration. Daniel brushed a crumb of frosting from my lip and smiled. In that moment, clarity replaced doubt. Vanessa was not reacting to me. She was reacting to the fact that I had moved forward. The evening continued with dancing, with toasts from friends who spoke of loyalty and quiet strength. Each word felt like a counterweight. Vanessa watched from a distance, her expression tightening just slightly whenever applause grew too loud. And I understood then that the truth does not always erupt. Sometimes it gathers quietly, waiting for the right moment to be seen for what it is. By the time the dance floor filled with college friends attempting enthusiastic spins beneath the chandelier light, I had stopped watching Vanessa and started remembering. Memory has a way of organizing itself when the present becomes too loud. I thought about our childhood bedroom in Fairfield, the one with pale yellow walls and twin beds pushed against opposite sides, how Vanessa used to borrow my sweaters without asking and then laugh when I searched for them before school. I thought about the debate tournament senior year when I won a regional award and she told our relatives at Thanksgiving that the judges had probably felt sorry for me. Small moments. Harmless on the surface. Each one easy to dismiss. Each one adding up quietly. I had spent years convincing myself that this was normal sibling friction, that confidence and cruelty sometimes wear the same mask. When Daniel entered my life, everything shifted. He did not arrive with grand gestures. He arrived with steadiness. We met at a charity fundraiser in New Haven, where he asked thoughtful questions instead of trying to impress me. At the time, I knew he and Vanessa had dated briefly years earlier, a short chapter neither of them described as serious. I believed that history had settled. What I did not anticipate was how unfinished business can disguise itself as nostalgia. 2 nights before the wedding, while final confirmations were being made and seating charts adjusted down to the last place card, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It contained a screenshot of a conversation between Vanessa and a friend. The words were careful but unmistakable. She wrote that she had made a mistake letting Daniel go and that she intended to remind him of what they once had before it was too late. I stared at that message for a long time, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed something I had felt in fragments. I did not confront her. I did not accuse Daniel. Instead, I asked him again, gently, if he was certain. He answered without hesitation. Certainty sounds different from persuasion. It is calm. It does not rush. Back in the ballroom, I watched Vanessa approach our mother near the dessert table. Their heads bent together in quiet conversation. My mother's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like resignation. I knew that look. It was the look of someone who hoped a problem would dissolve on its own. I understood then that tonight was not about jealousy. It was about relevance. Vanessa had built her identity on being the first, the brightest, the chosen one. My marriage did not threaten her happiness. It threatened her narrative. The band transitioned into a lively song from the early 2000s, and guests formed a circle on the dance floor. Daniel extended his hand toward me again, inviting me back into the center. As we joined the group, I felt an unexpected lightness. Not because the tension had disappeared, but because clarity had arrived. I was no longer confused about what was happening. Vanessa's toast had not been a careless joke. It had been an attempt to anchor me to an old version of myself, the one who second-guessed, the one who apologized for shining. I moved with the music, aware of the rhythm beneath my feet and the steady warmth of Daniel's presence beside me. Across the room, Vanessa watched, her smile thinner. Now, her confidence slightly strained. The truth does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it only requires patience. And patience, I had learned, is not weakness. It is preparation. As the evening moved toward its final hour, the ballroom settled into that soft golden haze that comes after dinner plates have been cleared and heels have been kicked off under tables. Laughter grew warmer, less performative. Conversations deepened. I excused myself from the dance floor and stepped toward the long table near the entrance where a small projector and screen had been set up earlier in the day. It had been Daniel's idea to include a short slideshow of photographs from our relationship, moments captured over the past 3 years, weekend trips to Cape Cod, quiet Sunday mornings in our kitchen, the day he proposed at the edge of Lake Champlain with wind tugging at my hair. The file was already queued on a laptop beside the projector, waiting for the right time. I glanced across the room and saw Vanessa watching me again. Her posture straightened slightly as if she sensed movement in a story she thought she controlled. The master of ceremonies tapped his microphone and announced that we had one last surprise to share before the final dance. Guests gathered closer, forming a loose semicircle around the screen. Daniel joined me, his expression curious but calm. I pressed play. The first images appeared exactly as expected, Daniel and I laughing over coffee mugs, hiking trails dusted with early autumn leaves, meeting each other's families for the first time. Soft instrumental music filled the space. Smiles returned to faces around us. Then the images shifted. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. A screenshot appeared, dated 2 nights before the wedding, of a message Vanessa had sent to Daniel. The words were clear and unedited. She wrote that she believed he was making a mistake and that she still felt a connection she was not ready to let go. A murmur rippled through the room, low and restrained. The slideshow continued with another screenshot, this one from the conversation I had received anonymously, her confession to a friend that she planned to remind Daniel of what they once shared. I did not add commentary. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the images speak for themselves. The room grew very still. Vanessa's face drained of its easy confidence. She took a small step backward, as if physical distance might soften the impact of what was unfolding. Daniel looked at the screen, then at me, understanding dawning across his features. My mother pressed her hand lightly to her mouth, not in shock, but in recognition. When the final image faded, the music stopped. I turned toward Vanessa, meeting her eyes across the polished wood floor. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and measured. I said that jealousy is often a story we assign to others when we cannot admit our own regret. I said that tonight was not about revisiting the past, but about honoring the present with honesty. I thanked our guests for celebrating love with us and expressed hope that families can grow when truth is no longer hidden. No one clapped. No one interrupted. The silence felt different this time, not tense but clarifying. Vanessa lowered her gaze. For once, she had nothing to add. Daniel slipped his hand into mine again, firmer now, certain. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat gently and invited everyone to the dance floor for one final song. As music resumed and couples began to sway, I felt something release inside me. Not anger. Not triumph. Simply relief. The narrative had shifted without shouting, without spectacle. What had been implied earlier in the evening was now visible. And visibility, I realized, is sometimes the most powerful response of all. The final song carried a softness that did not belong to celebration alone but to reckoning. Couples moved in slow circles beneath the dimmed chandeliers, and conversations resumed in hushed tones that no longer felt curious but contemplative. I could sense the shift in the room, the way people were recalibrating their understanding of the evening. Vanessa had disappeared from the center of attention. She stood near the exit now, her posture no longer expansive, her laughter gone. I did not approach her immediately. There is a difference between exposure and humiliation, and I had never intended to humiliate her. I had intended to correct the story. Daniel leaned close and asked quietly if I was all right. I told him I was more than all right. I told him I felt steady. He studied my face for a moment, as if searching for cracks, and when he found none, he nodded. Across the room, my mother slowly made her way toward me. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor with a deliberate rhythm. She stopped in front of me and held my hands, her grip warm but uncertain. She said she wished she had seen the tension sooner. She said she had hoped it was only competitiveness that would fade with time. I told her that sometimes we confuse familiarity with harmlessness. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that truth. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices. Vanessa eventually walked toward us, her steps measured, her expression no longer polished but exposed. She did not apologize in the way people expect, with grand gestures or tears. Instead, she said she had not realized how transparent her fear had become. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was the first honest sentence she had offered all evening. I listened without interrupting. I did not list past grievances. I did not recount childhood slights. I simply told her that envy grows in silence and that I had spent too many years absorbing it as if it were mine to carry. The music faded and guests began gathering their coats, offering hugs that felt gentler now, more intentional. Outside, the harbor lights reflected across the dark water like small steady anchors. Daniel slipped his jacket over my shoulders as the night air cooled. Vanessa remained a few steps behind us, not excluded but no longer leading. I understood then that the truth does not repair everything instantly. It does not erase history. But it rearranges power. It places responsibility where it belongs. As Daniel and I walked toward the waiting car that would take us to the hotel downtown, I glanced back once more at the entrance of the country club. My sister stood beneath the soft glow of the exterior lantern, alone with her thoughts. I did not feel triumph. I felt clarity. Marriage had begun not only with vows but with visibility. The story that once defined me had shifted. I was not the jealous sister. I was the woman who chose patience over reaction and truth over silence. And as the car door closed and the engine started, I realized that sometimes the most powerful beginning is the one that arrives after everything hidden has finally been brought into the light. The hotel suite overlooked the harbor, and when Daniel and I stepped inside, the quiet felt almost unfamiliar after the layered sounds of the reception. I slipped off my heels and set them carefully beside the door, feeling the cool carpet under my feet. The city lights shimmered beyond the wide glass windows, steady and distant. Daniel loosened his tie and watched me for a long moment before speaking. He said he had not realized how persistent Vanessa's feelings had been. He said he had assumed time had done what time is supposed to do. I sat at the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, not because I felt fragile, but because I wanted my words to land clearly. I told him that unresolved desire does not fade simply because circumstances change. It fades when someone accepts that the story they imagined will not be written. He came to sit beside me and apologized, not for loving me, but for underestimating how much proximity can distort judgment. I appreciated the distinction. Marriage begins with honesty, and tonight had offered more of it than most weddings ever see. We talked quietly about boundaries, about how family can remain family without becoming a threat to peace. Outside, a boat horn sounded low across the water, reminding me that life continues whether we are ready or not. The next morning, sunlight poured through sheer curtains, washing the room in pale gold. My phone held several messages from friends who said they admired how calmly everything had been handled. There were no dramatic headlines, no social media battles. Just a recognition that something had been clarified. One message surprised me. It was from Vanessa. She wrote that she had been awake most of the night thinking about what she had tried to protect and what she had nearly destroyed. She said she had built her identity around being chosen and that watching me step into certainty had forced her to confront her own insecurity. I read the message twice before responding. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not offer immediate forgiveness wrapped in soft language. I wrote back that growth requires accountability and that accountability is not comfortable. I told her I hoped she would find peace separate from comparison. Later that afternoon, Daniel and I walked along the waterfront, hands linked loosely, the breeze lifting the edge of my dress. Couples passed us, tourists paused for photographs, and the world felt ordinary again. Yet something fundamental had shifted. I was not carrying resentment. I was carrying clarity. Vanessa's attempt to define me as jealous had revealed more about her than about me. And once revealed, it could not be reshaped into something harmless. That evening, as we prepared to leave for our honeymoon flight to Charleston, Daniel asked if I regretted sharing the messages publicly. I thought about the guests, about my mother's quiet expression, about Vanessa standing beneath the lantern light. I answered honestly. I did not regret choosing transparency over silence. Silence would have protected an illusion. Transparency protected the truth. As the plane lifted off and the coastline receded into a thin silver line, I felt no triumph, no lingering tension. Only a steady understanding that beginnings are rarely neat. They are earned. And sometimes, they require us to let the truth stand in full view, even when it reshapes the people we thought we knew best. Charleston welcomed us with warm coastal air and the steady rhythm of carriage wheels against cobblestone streets, and for the first time since the reception I felt the full weight of the shift behind me instead of around me. Daniel and I walked beneath rows of palmetto trees, past pastel houses with wide porches and hanging lanterns that glowed softly in the evening light. Our honeymoon was not extravagant, but it was intentional. We chose quiet over spectacle, reflection over distraction. On our second night there, we sat on a balcony overlooking the water, the scent of salt and magnolia drifting upward as the tide moved in slow, deliberate patterns. Daniel asked me what I had felt in the exact moment the slideshow changed. I thought carefully before answering. I told him I had felt calm. Not because confrontation is easy, but because I was no longer carrying uncertainty. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doubting your own perception. That exhaustion had lifted. In its place was something steadier. Over the next few days, life resumed its ordinary pace beyond our small world. Friends returned to their routines. Photographs from the wedding appeared online, filtered and framed to highlight joy rather than tension. There were no public disputes, no dramatic exchanges. Vanessa kept her distance. My mother called once, her voice softer than usual, and said she hoped that this would be the beginning of something healthier between her daughters. I told her that health requires honesty and that honesty sometimes arrives late. One afternoon, as Daniel and I walked along the waterfront park, I received another message from Vanessa. This one was longer. She wrote about growing up as the older sister, about how she had built her confidence on comparison rather than self-knowledge. She admitted that seeing me content had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She said she had mistaken her regret for rivalry. I read the message slowly, feeling neither anger nor vindication. Just recognition. People often call something jealousy when it is actually grief over a path not taken. That does not excuse the behavior, but it explains the impulse. I responded with clarity rather than comfort. I told her that I would not return to old patterns. I told her that if we were to rebuild anything, it would not be based on competition or subtle undermining. It would be built on boundaries. Daniel watched me type, then kissed my forehead gently and said that he was proud of how I had handled everything. Pride, I realized, feels different when it comes from someone who stands beside you rather than above you. On our final evening in Charleston, we sat at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor, candles flickering between us, and talked about the home we would return to. Marriage, I understood now, is not protected by avoiding tension. It is protected by addressing it before it hardens into resentment. As the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of coral and deep blue, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. The story that had begun with accusation had ended with exposure, but not destruction. The truth had not fractured my life. It had clarified it. And clarity, I realized as the first stars appeared over the water, is often the most generous gift that conflict can leave behind. We returned home on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The sky above Connecticut stretched wide and pale as if nothing remarkable had occurred in the days before. Suitcases rolled across our hardwood floors, and the familiar scent of our home settled around us like something steady and earned. Daniel carried our bags into the bedroom while I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the stillness register. The wedding was over. The honeymoon was over. What remained was ordinary life, and ordinary life is where truth proves whether it was necessary or merely dramatic. On Monday morning I drove to meet my mother for coffee at the small cafe near the green where Vanessa and I had once shared milkshakes after school. My mother looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier, not physically, but in the way her shoulders carried reflection. She apologized again for hoping tension would dissolve without being addressed. I told her that avoidance is often mistaken for peace. Peace requires clarity. We spoke not about blame but about patterns. She admitted that she had praised Vanessa for being bold and me for being agreeable, never realizing how those labels had shaped us. I told her that I no longer wanted to be agreeable at the cost of being unseen. Later that week, Vanessa asked to meet. We chose a public park in the late afternoon, neutral ground beneath tall maples whose leaves were beginning to turn. She did not arrive with defensiveness. She arrived with quiet honesty. She said she had spent years measuring her worth by who admired her and that watching Daniel choose me had forced her to confront how much of her confidence was borrowed from attention. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her that I was not interested in rivalry disguised as humor anymore. I told her that if we were to move forward, it would be as two women who understood that comparison diminishes both sides. There were no dramatic embraces, no instant transformation. Just an understanding that something had been named correctly for the first time. Over the next months, our interactions shifted in small but noticeable ways. Vanessa stopped framing stories around competition. She asked questions instead of making assumptions. Daniel and I settled into married life with routines that felt calm rather than reactive. We hosted dinners where laughter was no longer edged with tension. I learned that boundaries do not fracture families when they are expressed clearly. They redefine them. One evening, as I sorted through framed photographs from the wedding to place on our living room shelf, I paused on one image taken just after the slideshow ended. Daniel and I stood side by side, hands linked, faces composed but resolute. In the background, Vanessa was visible, not erased but no longer at the center. I realized then that the most important shift had not been public. It had been internal. I no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood. I no longer absorbed someone else's regret as if it were my flaw. The accusation that once echoed across a ballroom had lost its power because it had been examined in full light. I did not lose a sister that night. I lost the illusion that staying silent keeps harmony intact. And in its place, I gained something far steadier than approval. I gained the certainty that truth, spoken calmly and without cruelty, can reshape a story without destroying it.